Today, there are more than 8 billion human beings on Earth. We have colonized every corner, metropolises, countryside, mountains, deserts. We've built skyscrapers, sent rockets to Mars, and invented the internet. We dominate our planet like no other species has ever done. Yet, if you could have observed the world 900,000 years ago, the picture would have been radically different. At that time, there were only 1,280 individuals of our species left on the entire globe. Not 1.28 million, not even 128,000, but only 1,280 individuals of reproductive age. That's it. The future of humanity hung by a thread so thin that it's almost unimaginable that we are here today. You know that feeling of realizing how close you came to disaster, like when you slam on the brakes just in time to avoid a truck by inches. That's exactly what happened to our species, with the difference that it didn't play out in a fraction of a second but was stretched over 117,000 years of struggle for survival. And the craziest thing is that nobody knew about it until 2023. Scientists had always suspected that humanity had experienced some form of demographic collapse in its distant past. Our genetic diversity is strangely low compared to other animals. Chimpanzees, who live in small, scattered groups in Africa, have much greater genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. This is not a coincidence, it is the mark of a genetic bottleneck. But no one had measured how severe it was. No one suspected that it had almost ended everything before things had even begun. The story begins 5 years ago with a researcher, Wang Zhu, from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He was performing a standard genetic analysis on modern human populations to understand our evolutionary history. He examined the DNA of more than 3,000 people around the world, tracing mutations like a molecular clock. That's when he noticed something strange in his data. Around 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures simply collapsed. It's like watching a movie and suddenly seeing 99% of the actors disappear from the screen. The mathematical models screamed that a catastrophic event had occurred, but the numbers were so extreme that Wang Zhu didn't believe it. He thought it was a mistake in his analysis. Because if those calculations were correct, our ancestors would have been reduced to a population smaller than that of a typical high school. He spent years double-checking everything, redoing the analyses with different methods. Each time, the result was the same. 98.7% of human ancestors were wiped out approximately 930,000 years ago, and the survivors remained at a critical level for more than 100,000 years. That's longer than Homo sapiens as a species has existed. One might think that species often recover from near-extinction situations. This is wrong. When populations become this small, they typically don't bounce back, they go extinct. Mathematical models show that once the population is reduced to around 1,000 individuals, you enter an extinction vortex. Genetic problems accumulate. Inbreeding increases. A random disaster can wipe out the entire group. Most species reaching such low numbers disappear forever. But somehow, our ancestors didn't go extinct. For 117,000 years, they held on. Through ice ages, droughts, and the extinction of countless other species, a tiny population of early humans, scattered in who knows where, kept the flame of humanity alive when it should have gone out. What makes this discovery even more incredible is the timing. 900,000 years ago, we were in the middle of what geologists call the early to middle Pleistocene transition, a period when Earth's climate went completely wild. Before that, ice ages followed relatively predictable 41,000-year cycles. Things got tough, but manageable. But around 900,000 years ago, everything changed. The glacial cycles shifted to brutal 100,000-year patterns. Glaciers became massive, covering vast parts of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of meters, and ocean temperatures plummeted. And in Africa, where our ancestors lived, the climate became incredibly harsh and dry. Imagine yourself as an early human, perhaps Homo erectus, living in what was once a lush forest. Over generations, your world turns into an arid desert. Water sources disappear, the animals you hunt go extinct. Plant food becomes scarce. And the situation doesn't get better, it gets worse for thousands and thousands of years. This is what scientists call a perfect storm for mass extinction. And that's exactly what happened to most human populations. They were wiped out. Only a tiny group, somewhere in Africa, managed to survive. We don't know exactly where or how, but they did it. The story gets even more mind-blowing. During this bottleneck, an unprecedented event occurred in human genetics. 2 of our ancestral chromosomes fused to form a single one. This is why humans have 46 chromosomes, while our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosomal fusion is incredibly rare. It might happen once every few million years, and it happened right in the middle of our near extinction. This wasn't a coincidence. When populations are very small, unusual genetic changes can spread throughout the group much faster than normal. If one individual carried this chromosomal fusion and survived to reproduce, their children carried it. And in a population of just 1,280 people, a genetic change like this could become universal in just a few generations. Today, every human on Earth carries this fused chromosome, chromosome 2. It contains the genetic signature of those desperate 117,000 years when humanity almost disappeared. Scientists can even pinpoint the exact location of the fusion. They can see the molecular scars where 2 ancient chromosomes joined together. It's like forensic evidence from the most important crime scene in human history. But the chromosomal fusion did more than just reduce our chromosome count. Some researchers believe it may have triggered changes in brain development. The genes near the fusion site affect neural function. It's possible that this genetic upheaval contributed to the evolution of larger, more complex human brains. Think about it, our intelligence, our ability to create art, music, and technology, our capacity for language and abstract thought, all of this could trace back to a genetic accident that happened when there were barely 1,000 humans left on Earth. The evidence of this bottleneck is written in our DNA like a time capsule. Every living person today carries the molecular signature of those 117,000 years of survival. For decades, no one could correctly interpret this signal. Older genetic analysis methods were like trying to read a book through a keyhole. Scientists knew something had happened in our past, but they couldn't see the full picture. It took the development of new computational tools, like the fit-coal method created by Wang Zhu's team, to finally crack the code. When Wang Zhu first published his findings in the journal Science in 2023, the scientific community was stunned. Not just by the severity of the bottleneck, but by its duration. Most bottlenecks in evolutionary history are relatively short. A volcanic eruption wipes out most of a species, and then the survivors quickly multiply to fill the empty ecological niche. But 117,000 years isn't a bottleneck. It's more like a prolonged near-death experience for an entire species. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist at the British Museum who reviewed the study, said it best: it would imply the surviving population occupied a very localized area with good social cohesion to survive. What is even more surprising is the estimated length of time this small group survived. If this is correct, one imagines it would have required a stable environment with sufficient resources and few constraints on the system. In other words, somewhere in Africa, there was a pocket of stability, a refuge where a small group of early humans found everything they needed to survive while the rest of the continent was ravaged by climate change. But where was this refuge? What made it so special? How did 1,280 people manage to sustain a stable population for more than 100,000 years? Some researchers believe the survivors lived near reliable water sources. Others think they had developed crucial technologies, like the more effective control of fire. Fire changes everything. It allows you to cook food, which makes more nutrients available. It wards off predators. It extends the day, giving you more time to work and socialize. Most importantly, it allows you to survive in environments that would otherwise kill you. Archaeological evidence shows that around 800,000 years ago, there was a sudden increase in the use of fire by human populations. This timeline almost perfectly aligns with the end of the genetic bottleneck and the time when human populations began to grow again. Coincidence? Probably not. But the thing that really blows your mind is that the fossil record for this period is almost entirely empty. Between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, there are virtually no human fossils found in Africa or Europe. For a long time, anthropologists called this the fossil gap and couldn't explain it. Now we know why. There simply weren't that many humans to leave fossils behind. With only 1,280 reproductive individuals scattered over who knows how much territory, the chances of one of them dying in conditions that would preserve their bones for hundreds of thousands of years were incredibly small. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except there are almost no needles, and the haystack is the size of a continent. The few fossils we have from this period are mostly from Europe and Asia, not Africa, which means they likely represent human populations that were not directly part of the bottleneck. But the genetic evidence is clear: the ancestors of all modern humans, as well as Neanderthals and Denisovan, went through this extreme bottleneck. We are all descendants of those 1,280 survivors. Every person reading this story carries the DNA of that tiny population that refused to give up during the worst climate crisis in human evolutionary history. Scientists estimate that we lost about 65% of our total genetic diversity during the bottleneck. That's a huge loss. For comparison, the famous founder effect when modern humans left Africa about 60,000 years ago only reduced genetic diversity by about 15%. This loss of genetic diversity has consequences we still live with today. It's why humans are unusually susceptible to certain diseases. It's why we have relatively weak immune systems compared to other primates. It's why genetic disorders that would be rare in more diverse populations are relatively common in humans. In a roundabout way, our weakness is proof of our greatest triumph. Every genetic vulnerability we carry is proof that our ancestors were resilient enough to survive when survival seemed impossible. But the story doesn't end with survival. The most incredible part is what happened next. Around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The population of early humans began to grow again. Not slowly, not gradually, but quickly. In a matter of a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had spread across Africa and beyond. They developed new technologies. They created more sophisticated tools. They began to hunt larger animals more efficiently. They started building shelters and controlling fire more systematically. Most importantly, they began the evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to three of the most successful species in human history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovan. The timing is too perfect to be a coincidence. The genetic evidence suggests that the last common ancestor of all three species lived right around the time the bottleneck ended. As if the near-extinction event didn't just test our ancestors' survival skills, it forged them into something new, something stronger, something more adaptable, something that could not only survive in a hostile world but eventually dominate it. Ye Huan Pan, one of the scientists who discovered the bottleneck, put it this way: the new finding opens up a new field in human evolution because it raises many questions, such as the places where these individuals lived, how they overcame the catastrophic climate changes, and if the natural selection during the bottleneck accelerated the evolution of the human brain. That last point is crucial. Natural selection during the bottleneck. When population sizes are extremely low, evolution doesn't work in the usual way. Beneficial mutations take hundreds of generations to become common. Harmful mutations take time to disappear. But in a population of 1,280 individuals, evolution moves at lightning speed. Beneficial traits can spread throughout the group in just a few generations. Individuals with even slight advantages in survival or reproduction can quickly come to dominate the gene pool. For 117,000 years, our ancestors were essentially living in an evolutionary pressure cooker. Only the smartest, most resilient, and most adaptable individuals survived to pass on their genes. Generation after generation of intense natural selection, selecting for exactly the traits that would later make humans so successful: the ability to solve problems, social cooperation, tool use, communication skills, the capacity to learn and adapt quickly to changing environments. All these characteristics were likely honed and amplified during those 117,000 years of near extinction. The genetic bottleneck isn't just something our ancestors survived. It's something that made them, and us, who we are. But what was it really like to live through 117,000 years of evolutionary hell? Let's go back, way back. 930,000 years ago, and the world is ending. Not in a dramatic explosion or an asteroid impact. Slowly, brutally, one failed harvest after another. You are part of a small band of early humans, maybe 30 or 40 individuals. Your species doesn't even have a name yet. Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. Scientists are still arguing over the details. What matters is that you are human enough that your children's children, thousands of generations later, will eventually become us. And right now, you are watching your world disappear. The forests where your parents hunted are turning into scrubland. The scrubland is turning into a desert. The rivers that flowed year-round are now just seasonal streams, then just dry beds marked with cracked mud. Your band is constantly moving, following water sources that keep drying up, following herds that keep shrinking, following a hope that keeps fading. This is not a drought. Droughts end. This is the new normal. The Earth's orbital patterns have shifted into a nightmarish configuration. The northern ice caps become massive, trapping so much water that sea levels drop by hundreds of meters. The Mediterranean becomes a series of small lakes. Land bridges appear between continents. But it's not the ice that is killing your people. It's what the ice is doing to Africa. When huge ice sheets form in the north, they create a kind of atmospheric dam. The weather patterns that brought regular rains to Africa are disrupted. The monsoons that fed the continent's rivers become weak and erratic. What was a forest becomes a grassland. The grassland becomes a desert, and the desert becomes nothing. Scientists have a name for what happened to Africa during this period: aridification. The continent didn't just get drier, it got catastrophically drier. The fossil evidence shows that most large mammals went extinct. Antelope species that had thrived for millions of years simply disappeared. Elephant populations collapsed. When the large animals disappear, everything else follows. The predators starve, the scavengers starve, and everything that depended on hunting or scavenging, like early humans, is faced with a choice: adapt or die. Most made the wrong choice. But your small band, your group of 1,280 individuals scattered across the continent, you found something the others didn't. Maybe it was a mountain range that still caught enough rain to support a few trees. Maybe it was an underground aquifer that kept springs flowing when everything else dried up. Maybe it was a rift valley that created its own microclimate. Whatever it was, it worked for 117,000 years. Now, let's talk about what working actually meant. Forget everything you think you know about human evolution as a steady march toward progress. There was no progress during the bottleneck. There was only survival. Your band probably lived in groups of 20 to 30 people, extended families, everyone related to everyone else within a few generations. You had two, with only 1,280 reproductive individuals in total. You couldn't afford to be picky about your mates. Inbreeding was inevitable. Genetic disorders were probably common. Birth defects, developmental problems, reduced fertility, all the consequences of a gene pool that was far too small. But somehow, you persisted. The daily routine was brutal. Get up, Find water, find food, don't get killed. Repeat for 100,000 years. Water came first, always. In a landscape where most waterways dried up for half the year, knowing where to find reliable water sources was the difference between life and death. Your people probably developed an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to spot the signs of underground water, to predict which seasonal streams would flow the longest. You may have learned to dig wells, simple ones, maybe just holes dug with sticks and rocks. But even a rudimentary well that reached groundwater could sustain a family through a dry season. Food was harder. With most of the large game extinct, you couldn't rely on hunting like your ancestors had. You became what anthropologists call dietary generalists. You ate everything. Insects, always insects. Termites, crickets, beetle larvae. Pound for pound, insects are some of the most nutritious food sources on the planet, and they reproduce quickly, so even small populations can be sustainably harvested. You ate roots, tubers, anything that grew underground where it was protected from the heat and drought. You learned which plants were edible in different seasons, which were toxic unless prepared correctly, which could be stored for lean times. You became experts at finding eggs, bird eggs, reptile eggs, anything that contained protein. You probably learned to track certain animals to their nesting grounds, timing your raids for maximum yield without destroying future reproduction. And occasionally, when you got lucky, you found meat. Not the huge woolly mammoths your ancestors hunted in groups of dozens. Those were long gone. But smaller animals. A young antelope separated from its herd. An injured zebra. An old elephant dying of thirst. This is where fire became crucial. Early humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years. But during the bottleneck, fire wasn't just useful. It was the difference between life and death. Cooking meat made it safer to eat, killing parasites and bacteria that could wipe out your entire family. More importantly, cooking broke down tough proteins and made nutrients more available. You could get more calories from the same amount of food. Cooking plants was even more revolutionary. Many roots and tubers are indigestible or even poisonous raw, but cooked, they become important sources of carbohydrates. But fire did more than improve your diet. It extended your day. Without artificial light, most animals are helpless after dark. Predators hunt, prey hides. Everyone is in a state of sleep until the sun rises. But with fire, your band could stay active after sunset. You could work on tools, repair shelters, share information about where you'd found water or food. Most importantly, you could strengthen social bonds. And social bonds were everything during the bottleneck. With groups so small, you couldn't afford conflict. Every single individual was valuable. Lose one adult to a fight, an accident, or an illness, and the whole band was weakened. Lose several, and you might not survive the next bad season. So you developed cooperation skills that would make modern diplomats jealous. You learned to share resources even when resources were scarce. You learned to resolve disputes without violence. You learned to take care of the sick and injured instead of abandoning them. Most of all, you learned to share knowledge. When one person discovered a new water source, everyone knew about it. When someone figured out how to process a toxic plant to make it edible, that knowledge immediately spread through the group. When hunters devised a new hunting technique, it became common knowledge within a few days. It wasn't just about being nice. It was a survival strategy. In a population this small, losing accumulated knowledge when a person died could be catastrophic. So you developed oral traditions, teaching methods, ways of passing information from one generation to the next. You became obsessed with teaching children not just basic skills, but everything. Where to find water in every season, which plants were safe, how to read animal tracks, how to predict weather patterns, how to make and maintain tools. The children who learned quickly had a better chance of survival. The children who learned quickly had a better chance of reproducing. Over thousands of generations, you selected for intelligence, for the capacity to teach, for the ability to acquire and transmit complex information. You were evolving into something new. The genetic evidence suggests that during the bottleneck, human brain size began to increase. Not dramatically, that would come later, but measurably. The cranial capacity of human fossils just after the bottleneck period is noticeably larger than those from before. This makes sense. When survival depends on your ability to outsmart your environment, natural selection favors larger, more capable brains. But it wasn't just raw intelligence that was evolving. It was specifically social intelligence. Living in tiny groups for thousands of generations, you became incredibly good at reading other people, at predicting their behavior, at knowing when to trust, when to be cautious, when to share, when to withhold. You developed what psychologists call theory of mind. The ability to understand that other people have different thoughts and intentions than your own. This sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most complex cognitive abilities in the animal kingdom, and you were honing it under the most intense survival pressure imaginable. The archaeological record for this period is frustrating in its scarcity, but the little we have is fascinating. Tools become more sophisticated but also more standardized, as if small groups were developing consistent ways of making things and sharing those techniques across a wide area. Stone tools from the end of the bottleneck period show what archaeologists call cultural convergence. Similar designs appearing in different regions at roughly the same time. This suggests networks of communication between groups, trade routes, maybe even regular gatherings where bands would meet to exchange not just goods, but also knowledge and genes. Because about those 1,280 reproductive individuals, they didn't all live in one place. Basic population genetics tells us they had to be scattered. Put 1,280 people in a single valley and one single disaster, a flood, a drought, a plague, a volcanic eruption, could wipe them all out. Evolution doesn't make that kind of mistake. So they were scattered. Maybe groups of 20, 30 people separated by hundreds of miles, connected by kinship and trade networks, but living independently enough that no single catastrophe could destroy them all. This created what biologists call a metapopulation structure. Individual groups rising and falling, disappearing and being replaced, but the overall network surviving. It's like a game of whack-a-mole, except the moles are human populations and the hammers are droughts, diseases, and climate disasters. Some groups get hit and disappear, but others survive, reproduce, and send out migrants to repopulate the empty territories. For 117,000 years, this desperate game continued. Some generations probably lived relatively well, finding good territories with reliable resources. Others suffered horribly, watching children starve and die of disease. But somehow, the network held. And then, around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The first signs were subtle. Slightly more reliable rains in some regions. Grasslands that began to expand again after millennia of desert. Animal populations that began to recover. The extreme phase of the climate crisis was coming to an end. But by that time, your people were no longer the same species that had entered the bottleneck. 117,000 years of intense natural selection had transformed them, making them smarter, more cooperative, better adapted to survive in hostile environments. They had developed technologies that would have seemed magical to their ancestors. Better tools, more sophisticated fire management, improved food processing techniques. Most importantly, they had developed social systems capable of sustaining cooperation and knowledge sharing over many generations. When the climate started to improve, they were ready. The population growth was explosive. In a few thousand years, the descendants of the bottleneck survivors had spread across Africa and were beginning to expand into Europe and Asia. They carried with them all the survival skills learned during the crisis, as well as the genetic and cultural adaptations that had kept them alive when death seemed certain. These weren't just any humans. They were humans who had been forged by the worst environmental crisis in our species' history. They were the ancestors of all humans who would follow. Every person alive today carries genes that survived 117,000 years of near extinction. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We are all descendants of the survivors, all products of the bottleneck. All of this proves that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be strong enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. But the story was just beginning. What happened next changed everything. Imagine this. Your ancestors have just survived the worst climate catastrophe in human history. For over 100,000 years, they lived on the brink of extinction. Tiny groups scattered across Africa, clinging to any refuges they could find. Then the rains return. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, year after year, the grasslands begin to come back. Rivers that had been dry for millennia start to flow again. Animals that had disappeared from vast regions reappear in small herds. And your people, your battle-hardened, climate-tested, evolutionarily refined people, exploded across the landscape like the world had never seen anything like it. In just a few thousand years, which is virtually nothing in evolutionary terms, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had multiplied into the hundreds of thousands, even millions. They spread out from all the corners of Africa that had sheltered them during the crisis and began to colonize territories that had been empty for ages. But this is where the story gets truly wild. They didn't just expand as one big, happy human family. The genetic bottleneck had done something unprecedented for human evolution. It had set the stage for the most significant speciation event in our lineage. Around 800,000 years ago, that single population of survivors began to split into three distinct groups, three distinct evolutionary paths that would eventually become the three most successful human species in history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovan. Speciation usually takes hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. Species slowly diverge, accumulating differences generation after generation until they can no longer interbreed. But the bottleneck compressed and accelerated everything. Those 117,000 years of intense natural selection had created a kind of evolutionary spring. When the population finally expanded, it exploded in multiple directions at once. Think of it this way. You take a river and you force it through the narrowest possible channel for 100,000 years. All that water pressure builds up. Then, suddenly, you remove the constraint. The water doesn't just flow out, it bursts in all directions, creating new channels, creating new paths. That's what happened to human evolution after the bottleneck. The first group stayed in Africa. These would eventually become the ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens, but they weren't modern yet. They were still evolving, still refining the survival skills that had carried them through the crisis. The second group moved north and west, into Europe and Western Asia. These populations found a world very different from what their ancestors had known. Colder, more seasonal, full of new challenges and new opportunities. They adapted quickly. In a few 100,000 years, they had developed stocky builds, enlarged nasal passages, and cold adaptations that would make them perfectly suited for Ice Age Europe. They became the Neanderthals. The third group headed east, spreading across Asia and eventually reaching as far as Indonesia and New Guinea. We know less about them because they left fewer fossils, but we know they existed because their DNA still shows up in modern populations in Asia and Oceania. They were the Denisovan. Denisovians. All three groups carried the genetic signature of the bottleneck, the fused chromosome, reduced genetic diversity, and neural adaptations that had been selected for during those brutal 117,000 years. But they also began developing their own unique traits. The African population that stayed behind was confronted with an environment that was in recovery but still difficult. They had to be adaptable, innovative, and capable of exploiting a wide range of resources. As the climate continued to fluctuate, natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving ability, and the capacity to quickly develop new technologies when conditions changed. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this population developed what we now recognize as the key features of modern humans: larger brains relative to body size, a more gracile bone structure, and an increased capacity for symbolic thought. Most importantly, they develop what anthropologists call behavioral modernity, the ability to create art, use symbols, engage in abstract reasoning, the mental toolkit that would eventually allow them to dominate the planet. But that was still far in the future. For now, they were just one of 3 human species, all competing for resources in a world that was still recovering from the greatest climate disaster in human history. Meanwhile, Neanderthals were becoming something else entirely. Moving into Europe during the recovery period, they encountered environments that were still brutally cold and seasonal. Winters could last 8 months, and summers were brief and unpredictable. They adapted by becoming incredibly robust. Neanderthal skeletons show bone density and muscle mass that would make modern bodybuilders jealous. They developed massive nasal passages to warm and humidify the cold, dry air they breathed. Their brains actually grew larger than those of modern humans, perhaps as an adaptation to the complex challenges of Ice Age survival. But their most impressive adaptation was cultural. Neanderthals became master hunters. Not just opportunistic scavengers like many of their predecessors, but systematic, strategic predators capable of taking down massive Ice Age mammals. They developed sophisticated spear-throwing techniques. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups, driving large animals into kill zones. They figured out how to preserve meat through long winters, probably using natural refrigeration in caves and permafrost. Remarkably, they developed the first systematic burial practices in human history. Neanderthal graves show evidence of intentional placement, sometimes with grave goods. This suggests they had developed symbolic thinking, the ability to conceive of death as something meaningful, something worthy of ritual. They were no longer just surviving. They were creating culture. The Denisovan were doing something similar in Asia. But we know less about their specific adaptations. What we do know is that they were incredibly successful. Genetic analysis of modern Asian populations shows Denisovan DNA from the Philippines to Tibet, which indicates that they spread across a very large number of environments. Some Denisovan populations adapted to high altitudes, developing genetic variants that helped them process oxygen more efficiently in the rarefied air of the Himalayan plateau. These same genetic variants appear today in modern Tibetan populations. This is proof that ancient humans and Denisovan interbred, transmitting survival genes that still help people live at extreme altitudes. Other Denisovan groups seem to have been skilled seafarers. There is evidence that they reached islands in Southeast Asia that would have required sophisticated boat building and navigation skills. This suggests they developed maritime technologies thousands of years before any other human species. But here's what's truly incredible about all 3 groups. They were still connected. Although they spread across 3 continents and adapted to radically different environments, they remained genetically close enough to interbreed when their geographical ranges overlapped. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred when our ancestors finally left Africa about 60,000 years ago. Denisovan interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans at various times and places. The genetic evidence shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over hundreds of thousands of years. This reveals something profound about the bottleneck and its consequences. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had created a kind of genetic unity among all human populations. Although we had evolved on different paths for hundreds of thousands of years, we were all fundamentally the same species. All still carrying the chromosomal fusion that marked us as survivors of the bottleneck. All still sharing the basic genetic toolkit that had been refined during those desperate millennia. But each group was also developing its own specialized survival strategies. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of technological innovations, not just within one group, but within all 3. In Africa, stone tool technology became increasingly sophisticated. The simple choppers and hand axes that had dominated human toolkits for millions of years gave way to carefully crafted spear points, scrapers, and cutting implements designed for specific tasks. More importantly, toolmaking became standardized. Archaeological sites across Africa show remarkably similar tool designs, which suggests widespread communication and knowledge sharing between groups. This is the signature of a true cultural evolution. Ideas spread faster than genes, which allows for rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. In Europe, Neanderthals were developing their own technological traditions. They created the first hafted tools, spear points and knives attached to wooden handles with plant resins and animal tendons. This may seem simple, but it represents a major cognitive leap. You have to plan ahead, gather multiple materials, and understand abstract concepts like torque and leverage. They also developed what archaeologists call prepared core techniques for stone toolmaking. Instead of just chipping away at rocks until they got something useful, Neanderthals learned to carefully shape stone cores so that they could produce multiple identical tools from a single piece of raw material. This is manufacturing, a planned, systematic production of standardized goods. The Denisovan were also innovating, although their achievements are harder to trace, but genetic analysis suggests that they were the first human species to develop the systematic use of medicinal plants. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic variants that help process plant toxins, which suggests that their ancestors had learned to use poisonous plants as medicines, developing resistance through natural selection. They may also have been the first humans to practice systematic agriculture. Some researchers think that the genetic variants that help digest starchy foods in modern Asian populations originated with the Denisovan who had learned to cultivate and process wild grains. But perhaps the most important innovation was happening in the field of social organization. All three post-bottleneck human species were developing increasingly complex social structures. Extended family groups formed alliances with other groups. Trade networks emerged that could move raw materials and finished goods over hundreds of kilometers. This was no longer just about survival. It was the beginning of civilization. The genetic evidence for this social revolution is written in our DNA. During the post-bottleneck expansion, human populations show evidence of what geneticists call structured breeding patterns. Not random mating, but a systematic exchange of marriage partners between groups. This suggests that our ancestors had developed kinship systems, rules about who could marry whom, probably elaborate networks of gift exchange that maintained relationships between distant communities. They were creating the social glue that would eventually allow human societies to grow from small bands to tribes, chiefdoms, and ultimately states. But they were also creating something else, something that would prove even more important in the long run: language. No one knows exactly when human language evolved. It doesn't fossilize. We can only deduce its development from indirect evidence. But everything points to the post-bottleneck period as the time when human communication became truly sophisticated. The rapid spread of standardized tool technologies suggests a transfer of complex information. The evidence of trade networks implies negotiation and abstract reasoning. The burial practices of Neanderthals indicate symbolic thinking. More tellingly, the genetic bottleneck had created exactly the conditions in which a complex language would be most advantageous. Small, scattered populations trying to maintain connections over vast distances. Groups that needed to share detailed information about resources, dangers, and opportunities. Individuals whose survival depended on their ability to quickly learn complex skills and teach them to their children. Under these conditions, any improvement in communication ability would provide massive survival advantages. Individuals who could speak more clearly, understand more precisely, or transmit information more effectively were more likely to survive and reproduce. Over hundreds of generations, this selection pressure would refine human communication abilities far beyond anything seen in other species. By the time the three human species met again, modern humans meeting Neanderthals in the Middle East, Denisovan meeting both groups in Asia, they would have been capable of sophisticated verbal communication. They could share knowledge, negotiate alliances, even tell stories about their ancestors who had survived the Great Extinction 900,000 years earlier. But they were also starting to face new challenges. The world was filling up again. Resources that had been abundant during the recovery period became contested. And the three human species began to directly compete for the same territories and the same resources. The age of cooperation was ending. The age of competition was about to begin. Then came the meeting that would decide the fate of humanity. 60,000 years ago, the descendants of those African survivors finally left their home continent. Not all of them, just a small group, perhaps a few hundred individuals who decided to cross the narrow waters between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. They had no idea they were about to meet their long-lost cousins. For over 400,000 years, the three human species had evolved in isolation. Modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovan in Asia, each had become perfectly adapted to its own environment. Each had developed its own technologies, its own cultures, its own ways of surviving. Now, they were about to meet face to face. The first encounter probably took place somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, where African migrants would have encountered the southern edge of Neanderthal territory. Imagine that moment. You're a modern human, part of a small band exploring new lands. Your people have never seen other humans who look different from you. Then suddenly, you spot them across a valley. They're human, but not quite. Shorter and more robust than your people. Faces that project forward with massive brow ridges and enormous nasal openings. Bodies built like wrestlers. All muscle and thick bone. Neanderthals. Your first instinct might be fear, curiosity, or aggression. We'll never know what those initial meetings were like, but we know what happened next because it's written in our DNA. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight for territory. They formed relationships. They had children together. Genetic analysis shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over thousands of years. Today, every person of non-African descent carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA. This is the genetic signature of those ancient encounters, proof that when our species met, at least sometimes, they chose cooperation over conflict. But cooperation has its limits. The Middle East during this period was like a revolving door between the species. The climate would shift, and modern humans would expand north, the climate would shift again, and Neanderthals would push back south. For tens of thousands of years, the region changed hands repeatedly. Sometimes modern humans controlled the best hunting grounds. Sometimes Neanderthals did, but neither could establish permanent dominance until something changed the rules of the game. About 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Toolkit, a revolutionary set of technologies that made them much more effective hunter-gatherers. Sophisticated spear throwers that could launch projectiles with deadly accuracy. Bone needles that allowed them to create fitted clothing for cold weather. Fishhooks and nets that opened up new aquatic food sources. Most importantly, they developed systematic blade production techniques to create long, sharp cutting edges from small amounts of stone. These were not just better tools. They were force multipliers, technologies that allowed smaller groups of humans to accomplish what had previously required much larger groups. A Neanderthal hunting party might need 20 people to take down a mammoth. A modern human group with spear throwers and coordinated tactics could do it with 8. This efficiency advantage compounded over time. Modern humans could maintain larger territories with smaller populations. They could survive in marginal environments that would challenge even robust Neanderthals. They could expand into new regions more quickly and establish permanent settlements more easily. Neanderthals, who had survived the Ice Age through sheer physical toughness and close-knit group cooperation, suddenly found themselves outcompeted by a more technologically advanced species. But they didn't go down without a fight. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing violence between human groups. Neanderthal sites contain more weapons. Modern human sites show evidence of fortification. Skeletal remains bear the marks of interpersonal conflict. This was not genocide. It was competition for the same resources by two species that were just similar enough to want exactly the same things: water sources, hunting grounds, shelter sites, raw materials for tools. And increasingly, modern humans were winning. Not because they were stronger. Neanderthals were physically superior in almost every way. Not because they were smarter. Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average. They won because they were more flexible. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting survival strategies for Ice Age Europe. They were incredibly good at what they did, but what they did was very specific. Modern humans, products of the African recovery period, had been selected for adaptability. They could change tactics quickly when circumstances changed. They could exploit new food sources. They could modify their tools and techniques to handle unfamiliar challenges. When the climate shifted, and it shifted constantly during this period, modern humans adapted. Neanderthals, locked into successful but rigid survival strategies, struggled. Slowly, Neanderthal populations began to shrink. First, they lost the prime territories, river valleys, coastal areas, the best hunting grounds. Then they were pushed into more marginal regions, mountain valleys, northern forests, areas that modern humans did not yet want. 28,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals were living in southern Spain and Gibraltar. Isolated populations clinging to existence in refuges that were shrinking every year. Then they were gone. The story in Asia was different, but followed similar patterns. Modern humans encountered Denisovan about 50,000 years ago. We know less about these meetings because Denisovan fossils are incredibly rare. Most of what we know comes from genetic analysis, but the DNA tells a clear story. As with the Neanderthals, there was interbreeding. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic variants. Some Pacific Islander populations have as much as 6% Denisovan ancestry. Unlike the European situation, there seems to have been less direct competition between modern humans and Denisovan in Asia. The continent was vast enough that different groups could occupy different ecological niches for longer periods. Denisovan who had adapted to high altitudes continued to live in the mountains. Those who had become seafaring specialists maintained control of island chains. Modern humans initially occupied different regions, river valleys, coastal plains, areas that complemented rather than directly competed with Denisovan territories. But eventually, the same technological and demographic pressures that had eliminated the Neanderthals also began to affect the Denisovan. Modern humans were simply more efficient at exploiting resources. They could support larger populations in the same territories. They could expand more quickly and establish new settlements more easily. One by one, Denisovan populations were absorbed, outcompeted, or displaced. Some may have survived until a surprisingly recent date. There is tantalizing genetic evidence suggesting that modern humans encountered Denisovan in Southeast Asia as late as 25,000 years ago. But eventually, they too disappeared as distinct populations. 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans, were the only human species left on Earth. The descendants of those 1,280 bottleneck survivors had outlasted their evolutionary cousins who also descended from the same ancestral population. The three-way split that had begun 800,000 years earlier was over. But why did modern humans succeed where Neanderthals and Denisovan failed? The answer brings us back to the bottleneck. Those 117,000 years of near extinction had selected for very specific traits in all three species: intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, and adaptability. But the African population, the ancestors of modern humans, had faced an additional challenge that their European and Asian cousins had avoided. Africa had remained climatically unstable even after the worst of the crisis ended. While Neanderthals adapted to the predictable patterns of Ice Age Europe and Denisovan specialized for specific Asian environments, modern humans had to continue to adapt to constantly changing conditions. Decades-long droughts followed by periods of flooding, seasonal patterns that changed every few generations, and animal populations that appeared and disappeared unpredictably. This constant environmental pressure had kept modern humans evolutionarily flexible in a way that extreme specialization had not. When the three species finally met, the Neanderthals and Denisovan were like finely tuned racing cars, incredibly efficient under the right conditions, but difficult to modify for new challenges. Modern humans were more like all-terrain vehicles. Not as perfectly optimized for any single environment, but capable of handling whatever came next. This flexibility manifested in multiple ways. Technology: modern humans constantly innovated, developing new tools and techniques every few thousand years. Neanderthals used essentially the same stone tool technology for over 200,000 years. It worked well, so they stuck with it. Social organization: modern humans formed larger, more complex social networks. They could mobilize more people for big hunts or territorial conflicts. They developed trade relationships that moved resources over hundreds of kilometers. Demographics: modern human populations could grow faster and recover more quickly from setbacks. When disease or climate disasters reduced a group's numbers, they bounced back within a few generations. Diet: modern humans became extreme dietary generalists, eating everything from shellfish to mammoth meat to processed plant foods. Neanderthals remained focused on large game hunting, effective but vulnerable when climate changes affected prey populations. But perhaps most importantly, modern humans had developed more sophisticated communication abilities. The genetic bottleneck had created selection pressure for complex language in all three species. But modern humans, dealing with more variable environments and larger social networks, had pushed verbal communication the furthest. They could coordinate large group activities more effectively. They could share complex technical knowledge more accurately. They could maintain relationships across greater distances and over longer periods. When modern humans encountered Neanderthal or Denisovan groups, they were not just competing for resources. They were competing with a communication and organizational advantage that had been 400,000 years in the making. It was not a fair fight. 15,000 years ago, modern humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had developed agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex societies. The population that had once numbered only 1,280 individuals now included millions of people speaking hundreds of languages. They had inherited all the survival skills that had carried their ancestors through the bottleneck. But they had also developed something new, something their evolutionary cousins had never quite achieved. The ability to not just adapt to their environment, but to completely reshape it. The age of human dominance had begun. And it all traced back to those desperate millennia when survival hung by the thinnest possible thread. And somehow, and possibly, 1,280 individuals refused to give up. So here we are, 8 billion humans. Everywhere you look, Tokyo has 14 million people in its metro area. Lagos has over 15 million. New York, London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo. Cities so massive they can be seen from space, glowing like galaxies against the dark Earth. We've built the internet, connecting every corner of the planet. We've mapped the human genome. We've sent robots to Mars and telescopes to the edge of the universe. We've created art that moves people to tears and music that makes strangers dance together. We are the most successful species in the history of life on Earth. And every single one of us, every person reading this, every child being born right now, every human who has ever lived, carries the genetic signature of those 1,280 individuals who refused to give up 900,000 years ago. That's the part that stops you cold when you really think about it. Your DNA contains sequences that survived the worst climate disaster our lineage ever faced. Genes that were tested by 117,000 years of near extinction and came through. Chromosomes that fused under impossible pressure and somehow made us stronger. The way your brain works, the way you solve problems, the way you cooperate with strangers, the way you learn language, the way you care for your children, all of it was shaped by those desperate millennia when survival required every imaginable advantage. You are living proof that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. But this discovery means more than just a cool origin story. It explains so much about why humans are the way we are. Ever wonder why we're so much better at cooperation than other primates? Why we can work together in groups of hundreds or thousands while chimpanzees max out at maybe 50 individuals? It's because our ancestors spent over 100,000 years in populations so small that cooperation was not just useful. It was the only way anyone survived. Individuals who couldn't get along with others died. Individuals who could share, teach, and work together lived long enough to pass on their genes. For 4,000 generations, natural selection was fine-tuning our capacity for collaboration. Ever wonder why humans are so obsessed with teaching? Why we spend years of our lives just showing children how to do things that other animals learn through trial and error? It's because during the bottleneck, losing knowledge when someone died could doom the entire group. Our ancestors who were best at transferring information to the next generation had better survival odds over millennia. This created the teaching instinct that allows human societies to accumulate knowledge across generations. We didn't just survive the bottleneck. We became addicted to learning and sharing what we learned. Ever wonder why we're so good with tools? Why humans can use everything from stone hammers to smartphones while even intelligent animals like dolphins only use tools in very limited ways? It's because toolmaking and tool use were literally life or death skills during the crisis years. Individuals who could innovate, who could figure out better ways to get food or make fire or build shelter, were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. We evolved into a species that sees the entire world as raw materials for solving problems. But the bottleneck also explains some of our weaknesses. Have you ever wondered why humans are so susceptible to infectious diseases compared to other mammals? Why are we knocked down by viruses that barely affect other primates? It's because we lost 65% of our genetic diversity during the bottleneck. This includes many immune system variants that might have protected us from pathogens. We are all much more genetically similar than we should be for a species our size, which makes us vulnerable to diseases that can exploit common genetic weaknesses. Have you ever wondered why genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease persist in human populations when natural selection should have eliminated them? It's because some of these disorders might have provided advantages during the bottleneck period, or they might be side effects of other traits that were selected for during the crisis. When you're down to 1,280 individuals, genetic quirks that would normally disappear can get locked into the entire species. We carry the scars of near extinction as well as the strengths. But perhaps the most profound implication is what this discovery tells us about human unity. Right now, in 2025, there are people who think that racial differences between humans are meaningful in some biological sense. People who believe that populations that look different or speak different languages are fundamentally different types of humans. The bottleneck discovery completely obliterates that thinking. Everyone on Earth, literally everyone, descends from the same group of 1,280 individuals who lived 900,000 years ago. We have only been separated for a few tens of thousands of years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms. The genetic differences between any two human populations are smaller than the differences you would find within a single population of chimpanzees. We are all cousins, recent cousins. When humans migrated out of Africa 60,000 years ago and spread around the world, they carried the bottleneck DNA to every continent. When they developed different skin colors and facial features to adapt to new climates, they were just expressing different combinations of the same underlying genetic toolkit. The Aboriginal Australians who reached their continent 50,000 years ago. the Europeans whose ancestors survived the Ice Age, the Polynesians who navigated across the Pacific using stick charts and star maps, the Native Americans who crossed into North America during the last glacial period. All carried genes from those 1,280 survivors, all products of the same evolutionary crucible. There is no them. There is only us. And us has always been one family shaped by the same history of survival against impossible odds. This also has implications for how we think about modern challenges. Climate change, for example. Right now, we are facing another period of rapid environmental transformation. Not as severe as what our ancestors endured 900,000 years ago, but serious enough to threaten human civilization. The bottleneck discovery suggests that we have reason for both concern and hope. Concern because past climate disasters have brought human populations to the brink of extinction. We are not invulnerable. It is not guaranteed that we will survive just because we are intelligent. But hope because we carry the genetic legacy of the ultimate survivors. The ancestors who survived the bottleneck were not just lucky. They were adaptable, innovative, cooperative. They were willing to completely change their way of life when circumstances demanded it. Those traits are still in us. The same flexibility that allowed our ancestors to survive the transition from forest to savanna to desert. The same cooperation that held tiny populations together through millennia of crisis. The same problem-solving ability that developed new technologies when old approaches no longer worked. We are not the same species that entered the bottleneck 930,000 years ago. We are the species that emerged from it. Tested, refined, proven capable of surviving conditions that would kill almost any other large mammal on the planet. But survival is not guaranteed. It never was. The researchers who discovered the bottleneck, Wang Zhu, Yuan Pan, Hepeng Li, and their teams, have given us more than just an amazing scientific discovery. They have given us a mirror. When we examine the genetic evidence of those 117,000 years of near extinction, we are not just learning about the past. We are learning about ourselves. We are the species that doesn't give up. The species that finds ways to survive when survival seems impossible. The species that comes out of disaster stronger and more capable than before. But we are also the species that can lose 99% of its population and spend over 100,000 years clinging on by our fingernails before things get better. The bottleneck is both a warning and a promise. A warning that human success is never guaranteed. That we have come closer to extinction than most people imagine. That our current dominance of the planet is not the inevitable result of being the chosen species, but the hard-won prize of ancestors who survived conditions that killed almost everything else. And a promise that we carry within us, in our genes, the capacity to survive almost anything. That we are descended from 1,280 individuals who looked at a world collapsing around them and decided to keep going anyway. Every time you solve a problem, you are using skills refined during the bottleneck. Every time you cooperate with strangers, you are expressing behavioral patterns that kept small groups alive for millennia. Every time you teach a child something new, you are participating in the knowledge-sharing traditions that passed on crucial information through 4,000 generations of crisis. The 1,280 live on in us. Not metaphorically, but literally, in our chromosomes, our neural patterns, our capacity for resilience. 900,000 years ago, it seemed that the human story was ending. The climate had become hostile. Most populations had died out. A small group of survivors faced a world that seemed determined to kill them. They survived. They adapted. They multiplied. They spread across the planet and became us. Today, more than 8 billion humans live on Earth. We have built cities that house millions of people. Technologies that connect billions of people, art, music, and literature that capture the full range of human experience. We are the descendants of the 1,280. We are living proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be resilient enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again.